Hey guys, tonight we're beginning with something so ordinary, so stubbornly unglamorous, that most people would walk past it without a second thought. A curve in stone, a bend in weight, a shape so simple it almost feels rude to call it genius. And yet, for long stretches of human history, that quiet curve may have done more to keep people alive than all the speeches, banners, and marble statues of empire ever could. Because before a city becomes grand, it has to become safe enough to stand. Imagine an early morning in a Roman town, the air still cool from the night, the paving stones holding a trace of dampness before the sun begins to lift it away. Shopkeepers are unlatching shutters. A mule cart rattles over the road, with amphorae knocking softly against one another. Somewhere nearby, bread is coming out of an oven, and the smell of warm grain drifts into the street. Above all of this, almost ignored, is the thing making the day possible. A bridge that has not fallen, an aqueduct that has not cracked, a gate that does not sag under its own mass. The curve is already at work before anyone stops to admire it. That may be the most Roman detail of all. They were not only interested in beauty as ornament. They liked beauty that could carry weight. Before arches became widespread, large structures were always negotiating with gravity in a nervous, exhausting way. A straight stone laid across two supports can only bear so much before it begins to fail. It bends, it fractures, it reminds everyone underneath that confidence is not the same thing as engineering. A doorway may survive. A vast hall is another matter, and a bridge spanning moving water is another matter entirely. Human ambition kept running into the same hard truth. Stone is strong when pressed downward, but weak when stretched. The arch changed that relationship. By arranging wedge-shaped stones in a curve and locking them into place with a central keystone, Roman builders found a way to persuade weight to travel sideways and downward through the supports instead of forcing a beam to resist from the middle. It sounds abstract when explained like that, but its effect was deeply physical. A heavier load no longer meant immediate danger. Often, it meant greater stability. The structure pressed into itself. The burden became part of the strength. There is something almost soothing in that idea. Pressure, properly directed, does not always destroy. Sometimes it holds things together. And once the Romans had this, truly had it, not as a trick, but as a repeatable solution. The skills about their daily life changed. Water could cross valleys. Roads could pass over rivers without becoming seasonal acts of faith. Public buildings could widen, rise, and endure. A city no longer had to remain small, simply because its materials were anxious. Infrastructure could become bold. That boldness mattered because people survive differently when their world is reliable. A bridge is never just a bridge. It is grain arriving before hunger turns a crowd sour. It is a physician crossing in winter. It is soldiers, yes, but also traders, letters, tools, olive oil, wool, news of sickness, news of safety, news that someone you love is still alive in the next town over. A failed bridge isolates. An enduring bridge distributes strain, and it keeps one bad season from becoming a disaster in every direction. The same was true of aqueducts. It is easy to think of them now as monuments, all those pale stone tiers crossing open land with impossible calm. But to the people living below them, they were not scenery. They were water, arriving where water did not naturally want to go. Fresh water for fountains, baths, workshops, and households. Water that could be directed, measured, and depended upon. Without stable water, a city remains vulnerable to thirst, filth, disease, and panic. With it, urban life becomes denser, cleaner, and less fragile. And there is a quieter truth beneath all of this. The arch did not save lives dramatically. It did not charge into battle. It did not arrive with trumpets, and it simply reduced the number of everyday failures that kill people slowly and without legend. Collapse, contamination, delay, isolation. The invisible tax of living in a world where every structure feels temporary. Roman people, like all people, lived close to risk. A bad harvest could still thin a household. A fever could still carry off a child. A winter could still press hard against the old and the poor. But stable infrastructure changed the background conditions of survival. It made movement easier, storage safer, supply steadier, expansion more realistic. It widened the margin between inconvenience and catastrophe. That is what great engineering often does. It does not eliminate suffering. It narrows the number of ways ordinary life can suddenly become fatal. And perhaps that is why the arch still feels so strangely moving, and not because it is ancient, and not because it is beautiful, though it is both. It moves us because it represents one of civilization's most useful habits. The decision to solve a problem so well that future generations no longer feel the fear that once came with it. A child crossing a Roman bridge did not need to think about stress distribution. A woman filling a jar at a public fountain did not need to calculate the geometry holding the aqueduct aloft. A merchant leading animals through a city gate did not stop to thank the keystone overhead. They simply lived inside the protection of an idea made solid. And maybe that is the final grace of it. The inventions that most deeply change human life are often the ones that disappear into normality. They become part of the floor beneath thought, expected, unpraised, nearly invisible, and until one imagines the world without them, and suddenly sees how much fear they have been carrying all along. Tonight, then, we begin with a curve in stone. Not because it is flashy, but because it is faithful. Because it held when weight came down. Because it turned gravity from an enemy into a servant. Because long before empire was a legend, survival was a matter of whether the things above you stayed where they belonged. And for that, a quiet arch deserves more gratitude than most emperors ever earned. If the arch taught the Romans how to carry weight, the heated floor taught them something even more intimate, how to carry comfort into the body before cold could settle there and do its quieter kind of damage. Because cold has a way of shrinking life. It shortens the day without asking permission. It gathers in corners, in stone walls, in wet cloth, in the fingers of old people, in the chests of children, in the slow ache of joints that must still work, whether the season is kind or not. A civilization can survive glory and disaster in its chronicles, but in ordinary rooms, in ordinary winters, survival is often decided by smaller things. Whether the floor bites with damp chill, whether bath water feels worth the effort, whether a public room can remain warm enough for bodies to gather without flinching. The Romans, in their most practical moments, understood that discomfort is not just discomfort. Left alone long enough, it becomes illness, withdrawal, bad air, weakened bodies, and cities that feel less inhabitable than they pretend to be. So they built heat into the architecture itself. Imagine a bathhouse at first light in one of the colder provinces of the empire, and outside, the air is raw. Breath turns white. The ground is hard with morning frost, and every exposed surface seems to have its own opinion about human optimism. But inside the bath complex, the experience is entirely different. Beneath the tiled floors, a furnace has already been burning. Hot air moves under the rooms through a hidden void held up by small pillars. It travels through channels in the walls. The stone itself begins to soften with warmth. Not blazing warmth, not the sudden aggressive heat of standing too close to a fire, but a slower, more persuasive kind. The kind that reaches your feet first, and then gradually tells the rest of your body that it may unclench. That system, the hypocaust, feels modern even now, perhaps because it understands something timeless. People do not merely need shelter, as they need interiors that do not work against the body. Before controlled heating, warmth in most buildings gathered unevenly. One side of the room sweated by the flames, while the other remained unpleasantly cold. Smoke lingered. Dampness stayed where it pleased. Walls absorbed chill and gave it back for hours. In that kind of environment, the weak suffer first. The elderly, the sick, infants, anyone already living close to the edge of recovery. A warm building does not solve poverty or disease, but it changes the background strain on the body. It gives healing a better chance. And this is where Roman engineering becomes more than cleverness. It becomes a theory of civilization. A heated floor is, in one sense, a luxury, but it is also a public health intervention disguised as comfort. Bathhouses could function year-round. More people would when the room itself did not feel punishing. Damp interiors dried more effectively. Mold had less power. Cold-related respiratory misery, so common in enclosed stone spaces, could be reduced. Even conversation changes in a warm room. People stay longer. They breathe more easily. Public life becomes less of a test of endurance. The Roman bathhouse was never only about cleanliness. It was also about sociability, ritual, routine, and the management of urban life. Men discussed politics there. Business changed hands there. Bodies were scrubbed, oiled, soaked, and restored there. To keep those places warm in winter was not frivolous. It was a way of keeping civic life itself from retreating into isolation. That matters more than it first appears. Cold pushes people inward, but not always in healthy ways. It encourages cramped spaces, smoke-filled rooms, and the kind of resigned stillness that settles over populations when everything feels physically difficult. If an empire is to stretch into colder climates, it cannot rely on Mediterranean memory alone. It must learn how to make harsh regions livable. Heating is one of the tools that turns expansion from conquest into endurance. And the Romans, for all their vanity and violence, were unusually good at understanding systems once they saw their usefulness. They did not ask only whether a thing was impressive. They asked whether it could be repeated, maintained, folded into ordinary urban existence. The hypocaust was not one miraculous room somewhere behind a palace wall. It was a method, a way of making warmth travel, and a decision that architecture should help the body rather than merely contain it. There is something almost tender in that. Not tenderness in the sentimental sense. Roman civilization was often harsh, hierarchical, and entirely capable of cruelty. But tenderness in the infrastructural sense, a hidden kindness built into stone, a recognition that daily life works better when suffering is reduced before it becomes dramatic enough to deserve attention. The people who most benefited from this warmth were not thinking in theories. They were thinking in sensations. The relief of stepping onto a floor that did not sting with cold. The pleasure of undressing in a room where the air would not punish bare skin. The way warmed walls changed the smell of a building. Less damp cloth, less trapped smoke, less winter pressing inward from all sides. And these are small mercies. But human life is made of small mercies, more often than grand rescues. And perhaps that is why the Hypocaust feels so quietly important. It reminds us that civilization is not only the art of building upward, it is the art of making enclosure habitable. A great empire can raise triumphal arches, issue coins, and carve its victories in stone. But if its people are always cold, always damp, always forced into the exhausting intimacy of smoke and chill, then grandeur remains superficial. Roman heating did something more useful than proclaiming power. It improved the texture of ordinary survival. Not for everyone equally, of course. Wealth still shaped access. Comfort still followed class. But even in that inequality, the principle had been established. The environment inside a building could be designed. The body did not simply have to endure whatever season entered through the walls. Human beings could intervene, redirect heat, control atmosphere, create microclimates of stability against a hostile world. That idea would echo far beyond Rome. Tonight, though, it is enough to picture a winter morning, a furnace murmuring somewhere beneath the floor, and a room gradually filling with invisible warmth. Outside, frost on stone. Inside, air that does not wound. A civilization fighting cold not with heroics, but with channels, pillars, clay pipes, and patience. Sometimes survival is not the dramatic act of escaping danger. Sometimes it is the quieter miracle of making the room itself kind enough to stay alive in. Warmth alone, of course, is never enough. A room can be heated and still feel exposed. It can offer shelter and still allow the weather to enter in thin, persistent ways, through drafts that move like invisible fingers, through damp air, through the slow unease of knowing that the boundary between inside and outside is more hopeful than real. For much of human history, that boundary was fragile. A wall could stand, a roof could hold, and yet the room itself remained only a partial victory over the elements. This is why glass matters more than it seems. Not glass as ornament, not glass as luxury held up for admiration. Glass as a decision that light and protection no longer needed to be enemies. Imagine a winter afternoon in the northern reaches of the Roman world, perhaps in Britain, perhaps in a damp provincial town where the sky hangs low for days at a time and every surface seems to absorb moisture. Outside, the street is a mixture of mud, straw, and cold breath. Smoke from hearths drifts heavily, never quite rising cleanly. Indoors, in a building with no real window protection, light is hard won. Open the shutters, and you admit the day, but also the wind, the wet, the insects, and the chill. Close them, and the room survives, but at the cost of dimness and stale air. The choice is always a compromise. Glass changed that compromise. The Romans did not invent glass itself, but they refined its production and put it to work in ways that altered everyday life. A pane of glass in a wall seems like such a modest thing now, almost too familiar to notice. But it performs an astonishing negotiation. It lets light enter while keeping weather out. It permits visibility without surrendering the room, and it turns enclosure into something more sophisticated than a cave with ambition. And once that becomes possible, the indoor world changes character. A room with glass is warmer in a more stable way. It is drier. It is easier to illuminate during the day without relying entirely on flame. That last point matters more than it first appears. Ancient interiors were full of smoke, soot, and the quiet accumulation of particles in lungs and on walls. Every lamp and fire was useful, but each brought its own tax. More daylight meant less smoke. Less smoke meant air that was fractionally less harmful, less exhausting, less thick with the residue of survival. Again, it is a small margin. But human beings have often lived or died inside small margins. Glass windows also altered the emotional life of rooms. That may sound too delicate a claim for something so practical, but think of what it means to see the world without immediately being subject to it. Rain visible, but not falling on your face. A pale sky present without its cold entering your bones. The movement of people in the street while you remain held in a pocket of relative calm. This is not just comfort. It is psychological stability. A room becomes not merely an interruption in the weather, but a controlled environment. Controlled environments allow more than rest. They allow planning, reading, conversation, craft, treatment, administration, all the quieter activities from which complex societies are built. the Romans understood, perhaps more instinctively than philosophically, that civilization depends on interiors working properly. Public baths, villas, workshops as official spaces, urban dwellings, all benefited from the ability to hold light without inviting in the season. In colder or wetter regions, this would have mattered immensely. Combined with heated floors and better construction, glass windows made year-round urban life more plausible in climates that otherwise pressed hard against comfort and health. There is also the question of fire. Ancient cities were always negotiating with flame. Cooking required it. Warmth required it. Light required it. But densely packed buildings, timber elements, cloth hangings, oil lamps, and human distraction make a dangerous combination. Any technology that reduces dependence on open flame, even slightly, contributes to collective safety. More daylight in enclosed spaces means fewer lamps burning at midday. Fewer accidental ignitions have fewer chances for one ordinary mistake to become a neighborhood catastrophe. So when we think about glass, we should not only think of elegance, we should think of lungs, walls, sleep, and risk. A civilization is transformed when its buildings stop behaving like temporary shelters and begin behaving like systems. The Romans were excellent system thinkers when it came to material life. Roads were not only roads, but logistical arteries. Aqueducts were not only channels, but organized survival. And glass windows were not merely refined decoration. They were climate management. They were visual access without physical exposure. They were a new relationship between the human body and the built world. Perhaps that is why they still feel quietly miraculous. Even now, to stand by a window in bad weather is to experience an old luxury so familiar that it becomes almost invisible. To watch rain strike the glass while remaining dry. To feel winter light enter a room without letting winter itself take possession of it. To sit in brightness without wind. It is such an ordinary pleasure now that we rarely stop to consider how revolutionary it once was. The people who first benefited from Roman glass would not have described it in architectural theory. They would have felt it in simpler ways. A room where fabric dried faster. A child coughing less in a brighter space. Walls that smelled less of trapped damp. Fewer insects drifting in with dusk. Less need to huddle around a flame before the day had truly ended. A corner of human life pulled slightly farther away from raw exposure. And this, too, it is a pattern in Roman invention. Not always dazzling originality, but refinement with enormous consequences. the practical perfection of a thing until it becomes foundational. Not the invention of shelter, but the invention of better shelter. Not the conquest of nature exactly, but a firmer negotiation with it. Tonight, then, it is worth lingering with this image. A Roman room in a wet northern province, warmed beneath the floor, light entering through glass, the weather visible, but no longer entirely in command. Outside, mud and cold, and the ordinary indifference of the season. Inside, a different atmosphere has been made by human hands. That may be one of civilization's deepest ambitions. Not to escape the world, but to create within it a habitable interior where the body can unclench, the mind can remain steady, and life does not have to be spent in constant argument with the air. There is a point at which a civilization begins to understand that survival is not only about walls, roads, heat, and water. It is also about what can be remembered without distortion, what can be found again without frustration, what can be carried forward when the people who first knew it are gone. Memory, after all, is one of the few defenses humans have against beginning from zero every time the world changes. And for a long time, memory was awkward to handle. Imagine a room in a Roman administrative building late in the afternoon. The light is thinning. Wax tablets are stacked on a desk, cords tangled among them, scrolls resting in niches along the wall. A clerk has been asked to find a specific legal passage, not the whole law, just one section buried somewhere in a long roll of text. He reaches for the scroll, unfastens it, and begins the familiar choreography. Unroll with one hand, gather with the other, track the column, overshoot, adjust, flatten, search again. The material is elegant, yes. Scrolls possess ceremony. They feel literary and ancient and proper. But they are terrible companions for quick retrieval. A civilization can endure a surprising amount of inconvenience, but inefficiency has a cost when repeated thousands of times across courts, archives, households, barracks, and places of worship. This is where the codex enters, quietly, almost modestly, and changes the texture of thought itself. Instead of one long roll, the codex gathered individual leaves and bound them along one side. Pages, a form so ordinary to us now that it is difficult to recover how radical it once felt. Suddenly, text could be opened to a precise place. Information could be divided, returned to, compared. A passage near the middle no longer required a small ritual of excavation, that you could move through knowledge with intention rather than endurance. That changed more than convenience. It changed law because legal systems depend on reference. A law that cannot be quickly found is less stable in practice than one that can be opened, checked, and cited. It changed medicine because treatments, observations, and remedies become more useful when they can be organized and consulted without delay. It changed administration because record-keeping grows sharper when documents can contain multiple related sections rather than flowing endlessly in one direction. It changed religion because sacred texts become easier to preserve, compare, annotate, and circulate when they exist in a form built for return. And return matters. The codex is, in some sense, an invention of re-entry. It invites the mind to come back, to pause and resume, to move not only forward, but inward. A scroll is a river. A codex is a house with rooms. You can remember where things are inside it. You can develop intimacy with its structure. Your hand learns what your eyes will soon meet. Over time, that physical familiarity becomes intellectual stability. This is not only an abstract benefit for scholars. It is a survival tool for institutions. Armies need manuals. Administrators need records. Priests need texts that can be read aloud, compared, and preserved across communities. Physicians need observations that do not vanish with one practitioner's death. Teachers need something their students can revisit. When knowledge becomes easier to access, it becomes easier to transmit. And when transmission improves, societies accumulate rather than merely repeat. That accumulation is one of the quiet miracles of civilization. Every generation inherits as less than it thinks and loses more than it means to. Fires happen. Floods happen. Libraries rot. Regimes collapse. Languages shift. Skilled people die before they can finish explaining themselves. Human continuity is much more fragile than monuments make it appear. So any tool that helps a society keep hold of its own instructions, stories, principles, remedies, and arguments is doing work far larger than its shape suggests. The Romans did not invent writing, and they did not invent the desire to preserve. But by normalizing the codex, they strengthened the infrastructure of memory. They helped move written culture toward a format that rewarded storage, retrieval, copying, and endurance. This would matter profoundly in late antiquity and beyond, especially as religious communities adopted the codex with particular enthusiasm. Texts that might once have remained scattered or cumbersome to handle could now travel in a more disciplined form. Ideas gained portability. Doctrine gained consistency. Commentary gained space to accumulate around the original words. It is difficult to overstate how important that is. A society with poor memory does not only forget facts, it forgets methods. It forgets mistakes. It forgets how a solution was reached, why a ritual existed, what caused the last crisis, which promises failed, which cures helped, which roots mattered, which stories held people together when everything else was breaking apart. In that sense, memory is not sentimental. It is operational. It allows adaptation without amnesia. And the codex made memory more operational. And there is also something deeply human in the physicality of the form. A codex can be held close to the body. It can be opened on a lap, hidden in travel, annotated in the margins, repaired, inherited, kissed, chained to a desk, wrapped in cloth, carried across weather and war. It feels less like a performance than a companion. That intimacy matters because people protect what they can live with. A form that is easy to use becomes easier to cherish. And what is cherished survives longer. Tonight, if we linger beside that Roman desk, we can almost feel the difference. One object resists quick entry, asks to be managed, insists on sequence. The other waits in the hand with a kind of patient readiness. Open me where needed. Return later. Mark this passage. Compare it to that one. Continue tomorrow. That is not just a change in format, and it is a change in civilization's relationship to its own mind. Without preserved knowledge, every difficulty becomes strangely new. The same problems are suffered without instruction. The same confusion returns wearing a different face. But with preserved knowledge, even imperfectly preserved, the dead continue assisting the living, not by haunting them, but by leaving usable traces. A treatment, a boundary marker, a law, a prayer, a map, a commentary in the margin that says, in effect, someone thought hard about this before you. There is comfort in that, and power, too. The Codex did not save humanity in a dramatic afternoon. No crowd pointed at it in awe. No army surrendered because of its stitching. But over centuries, it changed how memory was handled, and memory handled properly is one of the most life-giving things a civilization can possess. Because walls protect the body for a time, but stored knowledge protects the future. If the Codex helped the Romans preserve memory, then the dam helped them preserve something even more immediate, more bodily, more unforgiving when it disappeared. Water. Not water as a symbol, not water as a poetic image in a mosaic or a polished line in a speech. Water as stored survival. Water as the difference between a harvest and a failed season, between a working city and a thirsty one, between orderly life and the kind of fear that begins when people realize the sky has been stingy for too long. Because rivers are generous only when they feel like it. Rain falls where it will. Streams shrink. Floods arrive with more force than warning, and a fertile landscape can become difficult in a single bad cycle, and human beings have always lived with the unnerving truth that what sustains them most can also refuse them most completely. The Romans, practical to their bones, looked at that uncertainty and decided that dependence alone was not enough. If water moved according to season, then season itself had to be negotiated. So they built structures that could make water wait. Imagine a Roman settlement in a dry part of Hispania at the end of summer. The hills are pale under the sun. Dust rises at the edge of the road with every cart that passes. The fields beyond the settlement are not dead, but they are watching the sky with increasing anxiety. Wells are lower than people would like to admit. The memory of spring rain already feels distant. And above the settlement, had held back behind a wall of stone and calculation, lies a reservoir, quiet, heavy, patient, an artificial stillness imposed on a restless world. That stillness is not beauty alone. It is time made visible. A dam gives a society one of the rarest forms of power. Not the power to create water, but the power to interrupt its disappearance, to catch abundance when it comes, and prevent scarcity from arriving all at once. To turn a brief season of plenty into a longer season of endurance. And that changes everything. Agriculture becomes less reckless when irrigation can continue beyond the immediate generosity of the weather. Cities become more stable when water supply is not wholly at the mercy of rainfall. A bad month no longer has to become a catastrophic year. Reservoirs do not eliminate drought, but they reduce the violence of its timing. How they soften the edge of panic. They give planners, farmers, laborers, and households something precious, a margin. Margins save lives. That may be the quiet thesis beneath so many Roman achievements. Not perfection, not control in some absolute sense, but margins. Enough stored water that crops do not fail immediately. Enough transport capacity that grain can still move. Enough structural confidence that a bridge is crossed instead of feared. Civilization often survives, not because it has defeated uncertainty, but because it has given itself room to absorb it. Roman dams, particularly in parts of Spain and North Africa, reveal just how mature that thinking had become. These were not rough heaps of stone shoved against a stream in a hopeful mood. They were engineered masses designed to resist pressure through weight, shape, and intelligent siting. The point was not merely to obstruct water, but to hold it in a way that remained legible to maintenance, weather, and time. It is one thing to build a barrier. It is another to build a barrier that understands what it is resisting. And water is a demanding opponent. It presses. It seeps. It exploits impatience. It waits for weak joints, poor foundations, careless assumptions. To manage water successfully is to accept that nature is not impressed by ambition, only by precision. The Romans were rarely humble in politics, but in engineering, they could be surprisingly respectful of reality. They learned again and again that systems endure only when they are built in conversation with force, not in denial of it. There is something very soothing in that kind of intelligence. A reservoir behind a dam is almost meditative to imagine, not because it is passive, but because it represents deferred crisis. The flood has not been allowed to rush uselessly away. The rain has not been squandered. The landscape has been asked to become a little more predictable, a little less cruel in how quickly it turns from abundance to threat. And predictability is deeply linked to survival. When water can be stored, food becomes steadier. When food becomes steadier, migration slows, markets calm, tempers hold, and the line between hardship and breakdown remains unbroken a little longer. Hunger is never purely private. It rearranges families, governments, streets, and loyalties. A reservoir is therefore not just a feature of landscape, and it is a stabilizer of human behavior. It also changes the emotional life of a settlement. To live near a managed water source is to inhabit a different kind of future. You still worry, of course. Ancient life never stopped demanding worry. But the worry is altered. It becomes less immediate, less governed by the next cloud or the lack of one. There is relief in visible storage, relief in knowing that the last storm did not simply pass through and vanish, relief in seeing that some part of abundance was captured and held on behalf of tomorrow. This is one of the reasons Roman hydraulic engineering feels so modern. It is not merely technical, it is temporal. It organizes the future by redistributing the present. It says, in effect, we know bad conditions will come, so let us not behave as though the current good conditions are permanent, and let us prepare, while preparation is still easy. That mindset is one of civilization's finest habits, and perhaps it is no coincidence that dams appear less glamorous in memory than aqueducts or amphitheaters. They do not stride across valleys in elegant tiers. They do not gather crowds. They do not flatter imperial vanity. They sit. They hold. They do their work in silence until the day their silence proves to have been the difference between strain and ruin. Tonight, then, picture a Roman reservoir at dusk. The heat of the day is fading from the stones. Somewhere below, someone is drawing water that would not have been available without the wall above them. Somewhere farther out, a field remains alive for another week because the channel still runs. No one is praising the mathematics. No one is celebrating the pressure calculations, and they are simply continuing. Sometimes that is what salvation looks like in the ancient world. Not triumph, not revelation, just the long, disciplined refusal to let necessity arrive all at once. Water kept crops alive. Roads kept goods moving. Heat made rooms bearable. But sooner or later, every civilization discovers the same hard limit. You can build as brilliantly as you like, and still remain fragile if the human body inside your system is treated as expendable. The Romans, for all their appetite for conquest, understood something unusually practical about damage. A wounded person is not only a tragedy. In a disciplined society, he is also a question. Can he be stabilized? Can he be cleaned, sheltered, monitored, returned to strength? Or will he be left to chance, infection, weather, and the old fatalism that shrugs and calls suffering inevitable? That question matters far beyond the battlefield. Imagine a Roman frontier fort at the edge of the empire, somewhere cold and windswept, where the ground is hard. The air smells of leather and ash, and the nearest city is far enough away that help cannot be expected quickly. The fighting has ended for the day. Men are being carried back through the gates, some limping under their own weight, others pale and silent, blood stiffening in the seams of wool and armor. Outside, the world is still military, still noisy with orders and horses and metal. But inside one stone building, the atmosphere changes. There are rooms arranged with purpose, tools kept together, beds laid out, water ready, space for dressing wounds, space for watching whether a fever rises, space, as in other words, where injury is no longer merely endured, but managed. This was the valetudinarium, the Roman military hospital. It is one of those inventions that can sound administrative when named, and almost tender when imagined. Not tender because the Romans became gentle. They did not. But tender because they institutionalized a form of care. They accepted that bodies would break and decided that breakage should meet procedure instead of improvisation. That decision saves lives. Before organized medical spaces, survival after injury depended too heavily on luck. Luck in where the wound landed. Luck in who happened to be nearby. Luck in whether dirt entered first or help did. Luck in whether a patient could rest somewhere clean, or at least cleaner than the street, the tent, or the corner of a barracks room. Our ancient medicine could never perform miracles by modern standards, but its outcomes improved dramatically when treatment was expected, structured, and repeated. The Romans may not have understood infection the way later centuries would, but they understood filth well enough to fear it. They cleaned wounds. They used vinegar. They boiled instruments, or at least exposed them to heat. They built drainage into hospitals. They separated spaces. None of this made them modern surgeons, but it made them better than resignation. And resignation is deadlier than many diseases. The valetudinarian is important not simply because it helped wounded soldiers recover, though it did. It matters because it reflects a change in mentality. Medicine ceased to be only a personal skill, residing in one healer's hands. It became part of infrastructure, and a fort was not fully equipped unless it could also receive the damaged bodies produced by its own existence. War, in other words, had to account for aftermath. That is a grim kind of progress, but progress nonetheless. A civilization becomes more durable when it learns to repair what it uses up. This principle extends far beyond armies. Military medicine, once systematized, rarely stays confined to military life forever. Techniques travel. Instruments improve. Expectations shift. If one institution develops more reliable ways to clean, cut, stitch, drain, and observe, those methods eventually influence the wider culture. Care becomes more procedural. Outcomes become less random. Even when the knowledge spreads slowly, the fact that it spreads at all matters enormously. And there is also something deeply human in the atmosphere such a place would have created. Picture the sound of it at night. Not the roar of battle, but the lower, more intimate noises that come after violence has exhausted itself. A patient turning painfully on a cot, someone asking for water, the clink of a bronze instrument set down in a basin, footsteps on stone, a physician leaning close to inspect a wound by lamplight. Outside, empire speaks in commands. Inside, survival speaks more quietly, breathing, waiting, cleaning, binding, watching until morning. And morning, in ancient life, was never guaranteed. That is what makes organized care so powerful. It increases the number of people who live long enough to see the next morning. Not through heroism, necessarily, through sequence, through routine, through the humble but astonishing act of saying, "This wound will be assessed. This patient will be housed. This injury will not simply be abandoned to fate." The Romans liked systems that could be replicated. Roads were built to known standards. Camps followed recognizable layouts. Supplies moved according to structure rather than whim. The same instinct appears here. A hospital is a standard applied to suffering. Not perfect suffering, not equally valued suffering, but suffering nonetheless made legible to procedure. And procedure, when applied with enough intelligence, becomes mercy with walls around it. We often think of Roman power in its hardest forms: columns of troops, fortifications, law, punishment, monumental stone insisting on permanence. But the valetudinarian reveals another side of Roman durability. They did not only know how to strike, they knew that a world built on force requires mechanisms of repair, or else it consumes itself too quickly to remain stable. Healing, in that sense, is not separate from survival. It is one of its chief administrators. Tonight, then, it is worth pausing in that hospital corridor, somewhere far from Rome itself, where the empire becomes less theatrical and more truthful. Here are the people who carry the cost of roads, borders, and commands in their flesh. Here is the practical intelligence that refuses to waste every broken body. Here is the recognition that power is more enduring when it can mend. No, the Roman military hospital did not save humanity in one dramatic moment. It did something more lasting. It helped normalize the idea that organized care should exist where organized harm exists. That treatment should be expected. That injury should meet knowledge. That a society serious about survival does not merely produce bodies for use, but creates places where those bodies might be given back to life. And sometimes that is the deepest kind of civilization, not the ability to wound, the ability to refuse unnecessary death afterward. Not every Roman invention was made of stone. Some of the most important ones were small enough to disappear into a hand. A coin, after all, is an oddly fragile thing to build stability on. A bit of metal stamped with authority, passed from fingers to fingers, market stall to market stall, port to barracks, tax chest to grain merchant, and somehow expected to carry not only value, but belief. Because that is what money really is in any age. Organized belief, portable trust, a promise that the thing in your palm will still mean something by the time you need bread. And bread is where all abstractions eventually become serious. Imagine a Roman market just after sunrise. The awnings are still throwing long shadows across the square. Fish laid out on wet boards catch the light in dull silver flashes. A woman tests a loaf with her thumb. A mule snorts impatiently beside a cart loaded with oil jars. Voices overlap. Weights knock against scales. Somewhere nearby, a child is crying from boredom, while adults perform the older, quieter ritual of deciding what things are worth. In a barter world, this scene becomes slow, tangled, exhausting. Grain must be compared to cloth, cloth to tools, tools to labor, labor to animals, animals to whatever the other person happened to need that week. Every exchange is a negotiation not just of price, but of compatibility. That kind of economy can survive in a village, but it strains in an empire. The Romans understood this with their usual talent for practical simplification. If territory is large, trade frequent, and supply essential, then value must travel in a form people recognize immediately. Standardized coinage made that possible. Gold, silver, bronze, minted with known imagery, known approximate weight, known authority. It was not perfect, and later emperors would prove how quickly confidence can be damaged when metal content is quietly diluted. But at its strongest, Roman coinage created something much larger than convenience. It created continuity across distance. Distance becomes less dangerous when exchange becomes predictable. A merchant moving grain from one province to another does not want to negotiate from scratch at every checkpoint, and a soldier paid in recognizable coin can buy food where he is stationed. A tax collector can assess more consistently. A ship captain can take on supplies in one port, knowing that the money offered will not be treated like a local curiosity. This is not just economics. It is logistics softened into ordinary life. And logistics, as the Romans repeatedly proved, are a form of mercy when done well. Because when value moves efficiently, food moves efficiently. Materials move efficiently. Labor can be compensated without elaborate delay. Surplus from one region can answer shortage in another. Famine is not eliminated, but its spread can be interrupted. One failed harvest does not have to mean one sealed fate if another part of the empire can send grain and receive payment that everyone accepts without theater, as this is one of the least glamorous ways a civilization keeps people alive. Not through battlefield brilliance, but through reducing friction in the exchange of necessities. It is easy to underestimate how exhausting uncertainty can be in economic life. If every trade requires suspicion, if every payment invites argument, if every market is a fresh improvisation of trust, Then instability enters the body long before it becomes visible in law or politics. People hoard more, risk more, fear more. The poor are hurt first, as they usually are, because they have the least room to survive delay. A stable coin cannot cure inequality, but it can reduce the amount of chaos required to perform ordinary transactions. That matters enormously in cities. Rome itself, like other large urban centers, and depended on supply chains that would have been impossible to sustain through barter alone. Grain had to arrive. Oil had to arrive. Wine, tools, timber, marble, cloth, animals, replacement parts, military provisions, all of it moved through systems of exchange large enough to outgrow personal familiarity. Most people involved in those systems would never meet one another. The coin stood in for the relationship. It said, in effect, "You do not know me, but you know this stamp, this metal, this authority. Let that be enough for now." And often, for daily life, it was enough. There is something almost poetic about that. So much of survival depends on material things we can touch, yet beneath them lies agreement, and beneath agreement lies trust. The Romans loved visible order. Roads, walls, aqueducts, measured space, but coinage shows their understanding of invisible order too. A civilization cannot be held together by stone alone. It also requires abstract systems that behave reliably enough for strangers to cooperate. Strangers cooperating at scale is one of humanity's greatest survival tools. The Roman coin, then, was not just a piece of minted metal. It was a compact between distant hands, between farms and ports, between labor and reward, between state power and private necessity. It helped transform a collection of provinces into a more integrated organism, capable of redistributing goods and absorbing shocks with greater efficiency than looser economies could manage. Of course, no monetary system remains pure forever. Rome itself would later wound its own credibility by debasing currency, as especially when imperial needs grew desperate and silver became more symbolic than real. But that decline only proves the rule. Once trust in money weakens, anxiety multiplies, prices shift, hoarding grows, markets distort, stability thins. The body feels what policy has damaged: less bread, more unrest, sharper fear. In that sense, a good currency is like clean water or a solid bridge. Most people do not praise it during ordinary times. They simply build their days upon the assumption that it will hold. Only when it fails does everyone suddenly remember how much invisible weight it was carrying. Tonight, then, it is worth picturing a single Roman coin resting in a palm. Cool metal, worn edges. The emperor's face, perhaps, or some image chosen to suggest continuity, strength, legitimacy. It has traveled farther than most people ever will, and it has crossed roads, rivers, shops, ships, and tax ledgers. It has bought meals, lamp oil, sandals, tools, passage, grain. It has changed hands among soldiers, widows, bakers, porters, officials, thieves, and children sent on errands. It has done its work without spectacle. That is often how civilization functions best, not when it dazzles, when it quietly allows strangers to meet need without collapsing into confusion. And sometimes, in the long history of human survival, that small agreement in metal is every bit as life-giving as stone, fire, or water. Some inventions save lives by moving water, carrying weight, or warming a room. Others do their work with numbers. That may sound disappointingly bureaucratic, but bureaucracy has always had a more intimate relationship with survival than people like to admit. Hunger can be counted, and housing pressure can be counted. Military weakness can be counted. The strain on a city's grain supply, the taxable land in a region, the number of men eligible for service, the growth of a settlement too large for its wells and streets. All of these become more manageable once they stop being guessed at. And guessing, on the scale of empire, is a dangerous habit. Imagine a Roman official arriving in a provincial town at the edge of harvest season. The roads are dusty with late summer traffic. Mules are being driven in from the surrounding farms. Families are standing outside doorways as names, property, and obligations are recorded in voices made formal by repetition. Nobody loves the process. Children fidget. Farmers resent interruption. Wealthier men become suddenly interested in appearing poorer than they are. Yet beneath the irritation is a truth as old as administration itself. The state is trying to see, and there is power in being seen, even when that power is not entirely kind. The Roman census is often remembered as an instrument of taxation and military organization, which, of course, it was. Empires do not count people out of pure philosophical curiosity. They count because counted people can be used, assessed, organized, and burdened. But that is only one side of the story. The other is that counting also makes planning possible. Without numbers, governance becomes mood. With numbers, even imperfect ones, it becomes strategy. A city cannot feed itself on rhetoric. If Rome, or any major Roman center, wanted grain distribution to function, roads to be maintained, baths to be supplied, aqueduct demand to be estimated, or military recruitment to be coordinated, someone had to know roughly how many bodies were inside the system and what those bodies required. A settlement of 5,000 and a settlement of 20,000 do not stress resources in the same way. A district full of landholders and one full of laborers present different vulnerabilities. If the state cannot distinguish between them, it prepares badly. Bad preparation kills quietly at first. It appears as shortages, delays, overcrowding, waste in one place and deprivation in another. Then, if allowed to deepen, it becomes unrest, disease, hunger, migration, and the increasingly brittle mood of a population that can feel strain long before any official document admits it. The census did not erase these dangers, but it reduced the stupidity of facing them blind. That is not a glamorous achievement. It is, however, a civilizational one. The Romans had an unusual respect for legibility. They wanted roads measured, territories named, duties assigned, units identified, procedures repeated. Some of this came from ambition, some from paranoia, some from practical brilliance. But whatever the motive, the result was often the same. Things became easier to administer once they had been forced into view. Population was no exception. To count people is to convert human presence into something the state can work with, however imperfectly. There is a tension here worth sitting with. Being counted is not the same as being valued. Many Roman citizens would have understood that quite well. To appear in the census was often to be enrolled into obligation. Taxes, service, legal exposure. Yet even so, counted existence creates a kind of political reality. If a population is known, and it cannot be ignored in quite the same way as one left vague, grain distributions can be calibrated. Housing pressure can be acknowledged. Military strength can be assessed honestly rather than imagined. A counted city is at least somewhat available to planning. And planning, however dry it sounds, is one of the most life-preserving arts humans have ever developed. Ancient cities were always close to fragility. Too many people in too little space, dependent on supplies from elsewhere, vulnerable to fire, disease, contamination, and rumor. In such conditions, numbers matter. Not because numbers are emotionally satisfying, but because they tell administrators when a system is close to breaking. If population rises and water does not, trouble follows. If military needs expand while available manpower shrinks, borders weaken. So if taxation is based on fantasy instead of reality, the burden lands in the wrong places, and resentment grows faster than grain. The Roman census was one attempt. imperfect, but serious to keep reality from becoming invisible. This is one of those moments when empire becomes strangely modern. We tend to think of Roman power in hard surfaces, roads, stone arches, forts, monumental inscriptions. But data, even ancient data, is also infrastructure. A wax tablet filled with names may not look like survival in action, yet the consequences of accurate counting can be as real as any bridge. A bridge moves food physically. A census moves foresight. Both reduce the odds of catastrophe. One by carrying weight, the other by revealing where the weight actually is. There is something almost humble in that, though Rome itself was rarely humble. The census begins with an admission that the state does not automatically know enough. It must ask, record, reassess. It must return to reality and check whether its assumptions still fit. That instinct, the instinct to measure before acting, may be one of the most useful habits any large society can possess. Tonight, then, it is worth imagining those Roman officials again, writing by hand, asking questions that sound tedious, but are tied to very real consequences. How many in the household? How much land? What obligations? What capacity? Around them, ordinary life continues. Smoke from a cooking fire. A child leaning against a doorway. A dog asleep in the dust. The scene is small, almost forgettable. Yet from thousands of such scenes, an empire constructs a rough map of itself, and rough self-knowledge is still better than elegant ignorance. The census did not save humanity with beauty. It saved by making chaos harder to deny. It forced rulers, however selfishly, to confront scale. It transformed populations from rumor into countable pressure. It turned administration from theatrical authority into something closer to management. Sometimes that is enough to keep a society from stumbling blindly into its own shortages. And sometimes survival begins the moment somebody stops assuming, picks up a tablet, and starts counting. A civilization can survive bad weather more easily than bad information. Storms destroy what they touch and then move on. Confusion settles into the bloodstream. It lingers. It multiplies in corners. It travels faster than wagons, and often farther than truth. That a people uncertain about what is happening around them will begin almost immediately to invent explanations. Some of those explanations will be harmless. Many will not. Rumor has always been one of history's most efficient architects of panic. The Romans understood this, perhaps because they governed a world too large to remain stable on assumptions alone. So they did something deeply revealing. they made official information public. Imagine the Roman Forum on a bright morning, already alive with footsteps, bargaining, and small performances of status. Sandals strike the paving stones. Lawyers gather clients with polished urgency. Vendors call out prices over the smell of olives, fish, warm bread, and animals that would rather be elsewhere. Citizens cluster where they always cluster, not only where goods are exchanged, but where knowledge gathers. There, fixed in a visible place, stands a written bulletin. Laws, announcements, court decisions, public events, news from the state, not whispered, not carried only by private networks, not left to mutate entirely in the mouth of whoever heard it third hand on a side street. The Acta Diurna, in its simplest form, was a refusal to let public life belong exclusively to rumor. That may not sound life-saving at first, but information, like water, becomes vital the moment it is disrupted. Consider what happens in any large society when people do not know the rules that now govern them. When merchants hear conflicting reports about tax changes. When citizens cannot distinguish a legal order from tavern speculation. When military events are exaggerated into catastrophe, or when a public danger travels faster through gossip than through clear notice. Markets hesitate. Crowds harden. Trust erodes. Fear makes people abrupt, suspicious, and easier to provoke. Uncertainty has bodily consequences. Sleep worsens. Tempers shorten. Decisions become more defensive, less rational. And once enough people are operating inside that emotional fog, a city becomes more flammable than its buildings. The Romans, for all their talent for spectacle and power, were also exceptionally attentive to communication as infrastructure. Roads carried bodies and goods, yes, but public bulletins carried coordination. They allowed the state to say, in visible form, this is the law. This is the verdict. This is the event. This is what has occurred. The point was not democratic transparency in the modern sense, but Rome was perfectly capable of controlling information for its own advantage. But even controlled clarity is often more stabilizing than unmanaged confusion. A known order, however imperfect, causes less immediate chaos than a guessed-at one. That is one reason public announcements matter so much in urban civilization. Cities are made of strangers living close together. Depending on systems they did not build personally and cannot inspect in full. Most people do not know how the grain arrived, whether the magistrate was replaced, what decree was passed yesterday, or what decision in a distant court may affect local life next week. If those uncertainties accumulate without clear channels. Then the city begins feeding on speculation. And speculation is not a nourishing diet. The bulletin interrupts that. It takes the private machinery of authority and places part of it in sight. A person walking through the forum can stop and read what has been declared, rather than rely on a cousin's version of a neighbor's version of a half-heard speech. That matters for law. It matters for trade. It matters for social peace. It even matters for emotional temperature. A public that knows what is happening is easier to organize than one forced to imagine the worst. And people do imagine the worst. They always have. In this sense, the Acta Diurna belongs beside aqueducts and roads in the architecture of Roman survival. Not because it carried stone or water, but because it carried certainty. Not perfect certainty, not always honest certainty, but enough to reduce one of the oldest dangers in mass society, the danger of not knowing which version of reality will govern your next decision. There is something profoundly human in that need. People can endure hardship with surprising strength when hardship is legible, when they know what has changed, what is expected, where to go, when to act, what the rule actually is. But uncertainty drains the body in a different way. It forces vigilance without direction. It invites every private fear to expand into public consequence. A city that communicates badly will eventually suffer not only from poor policy, but from the corrosive strain of unnecessary guessing. Rome, in its most competent moments, tried to reduce that guessing. The Acta Diurna also did something quieter, but no less important. It created records, as information displayed publicly does not vanish as easily into private memory. Events become fixed, however selectively. Decisions acquire a trace. The state begins, in effect, to remember itself in front of its own people. And institutional memory, like personal memory, is one of the few defenses a civilization has against repeating confusion with full confidence. Tonight, if we stand in that forum crowd for a moment, we can feel the odd intimacy of public information. Someone leans in to read. Someone else asks what it says. A merchant adjusts his plans accordingly. A citizen mutters approval or disgust. A legal dispute changes direction because a decision has now been made visible. A rumor loses force because it has collided with something written down in daylight. This is not drama in the usual historical sense. No legion charging, and no temple burning, no emperor posing in bronze certainty. It is more useful than that. It is a society trying, however imperfectly, to keep silence from becoming dangerous, because dangerous silence is never truly silent. It fills quickly with invention, suspicion, and the kind of restless misunderstanding that turns ordinary strain into collective instability. The Roman public bulletin did not eliminate that danger, but it narrowed its field. It gave people something to point to, something to verify, something more durable than breath. And sometimes civilization survives not because everyone agrees, but because enough people are at least arguing from the same visible page. Building something impressive is one kind of intelligence. Keeping it functional year after year through weather, theft, pressure, neglect, and the ordinary laziness that creeps into every human system is another kind entirely. The Romans, at their best, understood that second kind better than most. How anyone can admire an aqueduct when it is new. Pale stone, clean lines, water moving where water should not naturally be able to move. It looks like mastery. But the true test of infrastructure begins after admiration fades. Mineral deposits gather. Small cracks widen. Illegal taps appear. A support settles by an inch too much. A channel clogs. Somewhere along the line, a thing that once represented order begins, very quietly, to drift toward failure. And failure, in large systems, rarely arrives all at once. It accumulates in neglected details. Imagine a Roman aqueduct outside a crowded city, not on the day it is inaugurated, but years later, after heat, rain, and the slow chemistry of running water have had time to leave their marks. At first glance, it still looks eternal. The arches stand. The channel runs, as the public fountains in the city below still pour into basins where women fill jars. Laborers rinse dust from their hands. Children splash when nobody is stopping them. And old men linger longer than necessary because moving water remains one of civilization's quietest comforts. But somewhere upstream, an inspector is walking the line. He notices a deposit thickening along the stone. He checks whether a join is weakening. He looks for evidence that someone has tried to divert more than their lawful share. That walk may matter more than the original construction, because clean water only saves lives if it keeps arriving cleanly. Rome did not merely build aqueducts and hope. It assigned oversight. It created positions like the curator aquarum, charged with supervising urban water supply. It enforced regulations. It sent crews to repair, clear, reinforce, and monitor. This is not the most romantic part of Roman history, which may be why it is often overshadowed by the arches themselves. Yet it reveals something profound about Roman durability. They understood that systems survive not only by design, but by discipline. Discipline is a deeply undervalued form of mercy. A city whose water channels are inspected is less likely to wake one morning to contamination, shortage, or structural collapse. Preventive maintenance prevents the kind of crisis that seems sudden only because all its warnings were ignored. When a water system fails, the consequences are swift and bodily. Fountains go dry. Baths stagnate. Cleaning becomes harder. Disease finds easier passage. Tempers worsen. Crowded places become more dangerous. Panic enters long before help arrives. But if the system is cared for before it breaks, most people never experience that panic at all. That is the ideal success of infrastructure, not visible triumph, but invisible avoidance. The same Roman mentality appears in their bridges. A bridge is often remembered as a feat of construction, and indeed it is. Foundations sunk into riverbeds, arches distributing weight, piers shaped to reduce the violence of current. But a functioning bridge is also a commitment to continuity. It must withstand flood, debris, temperature, wear, and the endless repetition of passage. Carts, animals, soldiers, merchants, travelers, all crossing day after day with the casual trust that they will reach the other side. That trust is only possible when someone, somewhere, has taken seriously the responsibility of making endurance part of the design. And imagine one of those Roman stone bridges in the early morning mist. The river beneath it is not calm in any sentimental way. It presses, swirls, mutters around the piers with the steady irritation of water denied a clear path. Above, the bridge simply remains. A pair of traders crosses with pack animals. A courier moves faster than they do, carrying news that matters more because it will arrive on time. Later, perhaps, a cart of grain follows. Later still, someone returning home with medicine. None of them stops to praise the geometry. They are living inside the benefit of a system that has been made trustworthy. Trustworthy infrastructure changes survival in ways so constant they become almost invisible. When bridges hold, communities remain connected through seasons that would otherwise isolate them. Food moves when it is needed, and not merely when the weather is agreeable. Help arrives before a problem deepens into calamity. A town separated by floodwater is one kind of town. That same town, linked by a durable crossing, is another. One is at the mercy of interruption. The other has a chance at continuity. Continuity is one of the great life-saving luxuries of civilization. The Romans knew this, And not only in the grand sense. They built roads with drainage. They protected aqueduct routes from encroachment. They laid out infrastructure according to standards that made inspection and repair more possible. There is a practical humility in that. A road will degrade. A channel will clog. A bridge will suffer stress. So plan for that. Build with future weakness in mind. Assume wear. Expect pressure. Arrange systems not merely to function when new, but to remain legible when old. This may be one of the deepest forms of intelligence any society can possess. Not brilliance in isolated moments, but the refusal to confuse achievement with permanence. Tonight, then, it is worth lingering not at the moment of Roman invention, but at the quieter moment afterward. The worker clearing mineral buildup from a channel. The official checking whether public fountains still receive priority. The repair crew reinforcing a weakened section before it collapses. The mason examining stone along a bridge that still carries the day's traffic. No crowd applauds them. No historian gives them a triumph. Yet without them, the visible glory of Roman engineering becomes only a delayed disappointment. There is something almost moral in that. Maintenance is a form of respect for future lives. At it says that the people who will depend on this tomorrow matter as much as those praising it today. It says that systems are obligations, not trophies. It says that prevention deserves labor, even when prevention leaves behind no dramatic story. And perhaps that is the most Roman lesson of all. They were not always wise, not always humane, not always stable in their politics. But when it came to infrastructure, they often recognized a truth that many societies relearn the hard way. Collapse begins long before collapse becomes visible. It begins in unattended details, tolerated shortcuts, and the belief that what worked once will keep working by habit alone. The Romans resisted that belief with inspection, repair, regulation, and stone laid carefully enough to survive complaint from water itself. And sometimes, humanity is not saved by the bridge. Sometimes, it is saved by the culture that keeps checking whether the bridge is still sound. There is a particular kind of danger that does not always look like danger at first. Delay. Not the dramatic kind, not the delay of a hero arriving one heartbeat too late in some polished story, but the slower, more administrative delay that ruins real societies. Grain arriving after the city has already begun to panic. Orders reaching a frontier after the enemy has already crossed. News of disease moving more slowly than the disease itself. A ship finding the harbor only after rock and darkness have already made their argument. The Romans were unusually good at understanding that time itself could be engineered. Not controlled completely, never that, but shortened, guided, disciplined. And says, and once a civilization begins reducing delay, it starts saving lives in ways almost too subtle for monuments and too important for neglect. Imagine the Mediterranean at night, the sea breathing in long, dark motions beneath a sky with almost no mercy for the lost. A merchant vessel is approaching the coast after days of uncertainty. Its cargo, more important than any one man aboard it fully grasps. Grain, perhaps. Oil. Timber. Amphora filled with something a city has already begun waiting for. The shoreline should mean relief, but coastlines are dangerous in darkness. Rocks hide. Currents shift. A harbor entrance can vanish into black water until the ship is almost too close to recover from a mistake. And then, above the land, a fire. Not random fire, not a farmhouse flame or a brief signal. A steady light held high for the benefit of strangers, and the Roman lighthouse did not calm the sea, but it changed the final moments of uncertainty. It told ships where not to die. That is no small service to civilization. Rome depended heavily on maritime transport. Grain from Egypt and North Africa was not a luxury. It was urban survival. Cities of great size cannot eat symbolism. They require predictable food movement, and sea routes, for all their efficiency, are exposed to weather, darkness, and misjudgment in ways roads are not. A lighthouse is therefore more than a navigational aid. It is a stabilizer of supply. It reduces shipwrecks, protects cargo, and narrows the space in which accident becomes famine. Again, the Roman pattern appears. The useful invention is not always the one that creates abundance. Sometimes it is the one that prevents abundance from being lost just before arrival. There is something deeply human in that image, a fixed light maintained for people who may never know the names of those who kept it burning. Night after night, in salt air and wind, someone tends the flame so that unseen sailors can approach with more confidence than terror. No speeches, no laurel crowns, just disciplined guidance offered across darkness. A civilization that does this is, in its own stern way, practicing care. And on land, Rome found another way to fight delay. Imagine a courier setting out at dawn along a Roman road, carrying an official dispatch sealed with authority. The horse beneath him is already lathering slightly in the cool air. Milestones pass. Wheel ruts hold the shadows of the morning. At intervals ahead lie relay stations, fresh mounts, official lodging, the infrastructure of speed. This is the cursus publicus, the state courier system, and it reveals something vital about Roman survival. Information, to them, was not valuable only in content. It was valuable in transit. News that moves too slowly is often indistinguishable from no news at all. If a frontier governor needs reinforcements, days matter. If a drought begins in one province, days matter. If a law changes, a tax is levied, a revolt stirs, a magistrate is replaced, a road becomes unsafe, or an epidemic begins to murmur through a port, days matter. Time determines whether a society responds while a problem is still a problem, or only once it has already become damage. The Roman courier network reduced that lag. Not perfectly, of course. Ancient speed still belongs to the animal body, to roads, weather, stamina, and administrative competence. But compared with a world of improvised messengers and uncertain travel, the difference was immense. Relay stations, official seals, maintained routes, and recognized authority meant coordination could move with greater consistency across enormous distances. And coordination is one of the least visible but most life-saving forms of power. A society survives large-scale only if its parts do not remain strangers to one another for too long. That is what the lighthouse and the courier system share, though one burns in place and the other races over land. Both reduce dangerous uncertainty. Both shorten the distance between need and response. Both keep the center and the edge from drifting too far apart in knowledge. One helps goods arrive intact. The other helps decisions arrive in time. Delay, by contrast, is almost always cruel, and it lets a shortage deepen into panic. It lets a local conflict become a regional one. It lets a misunderstanding harden into policy before clarification can catch up. It lets ordinary fear multiply in the silence between event and explanation. The Romans were not compassionate in every aspect of rule, but they were practical enough to understand that delayed response weakens everything. A late army is a defeated one. A late grain shipment is a riot waiting to form. A late warning is the ancestor of preventable suffering. Tonight, then, picture these two Roman answers to the same problem. A lighthouse fixed against the sea, keeping a path visible where darkness would rather erase it. A courier moving fast over stone roads, carrying the difference between rumor and instruction. And neither looks as grand as an aqueduct or as solemn as a law code. Yet both are part of the same civilizational instinct. Do not allow distance to become disorder. Do not allow darkness to become wreckage. Do not allow time to turn manageable strain into irreversible loss. Sometimes, what saves people is not greater strength. it is earlier arrival. By the time we reach the end of this quiet Roman story, a pattern begins to reveal itself. The Romans were not always the first to imagine a thing. They were not always the gentlest, nor the wisest, nor the most original in every field they touched. But they possessed a particular talent that may have mattered more than brilliance alone. They knew how to take a useful idea, organize it, standardize it, repeat it, and unfold it into the daily machinery of survival until it became difficult to imagine life without it. That may be their deepest invention, not the arch by itself, not the heated floor, the codex, the dam, the coin, the census, the public bulletin, the bridge, the hospital, the lighthouse, or the courier system in isolation, but the habit beneath them all. The habit of building a world where failure in one place did not immediately become collapse everywhere. Imagine Rome at dusk, not as a postcard of ruins, but as a living system at the height of its coherence. Water still moving into the city, couriers still arriving with sealed messages, grain unloading in ports far from the capital and beginning its journey inland. Bridges carrying wheels and hooves across rivers that would once have stopped them cold. Public announcements fixed where eyes can find them. Heated rooms softening winter in stone buildings. Doctors cleaning wounds in spaces meant for healing. Coins passing through market hands with the ordinary confidence of shared trust. And beneath all of it, something less visible, but perhaps more important than any one structure. Interchangeability, redundancy, standard form, the refusal to let survival depend on a single, fragile line. Because fragile systems panic. A city with one water source panics when that source fails. A government with one route of communication panics when that route is interrupted. A population fed from only one region panics when harvests fail there. Panic is not merely emotional. It is structural. It erupts wherever there is no spare capacity, no backup, no overlap, no accepted way to replace what has broken quickly enough to matter. The Romans, in their most competent centuries, built against panic. They used multiple aqueducts to feed the same city, multiple roads to connect the same territories, multiple administrative layers so that authority did not vanish the instant one man died or one office fell vacant. They standardized measures, materials, procedures, and layouts so that systems could be repaired without being reinvented each time. A brick that matches another brick is a quiet act of mercy. A road built to familiar principles is easier to mend. A camp laid out according to known logic can be raised faster, supplied faster, understood faster. A state that repeats forms intelligently wastes less time in confusion. And confusion, like delay, is one of the great hidden enemies of survival. That there is something almost beautiful in the Roman faith that a system should remain legible under stress. Not because they were serene people. Rome was often violent, vain, and brutally unequal. But again and again, when faced with practical problems, Roman thinking moved toward repeatability. How do we make this easier to build again? Easier to inspect? Easier to replace? Easier to understand across distance? Easier to slot into a larger network without everything around it having to be reinvented from the beginning? Those are not glamorous questions. They are civilization-saving questions. A road impresses the eye. Standardized road construction impresses the future. A bridge is useful. A known method for building bridges across the empire is more useful still. One functioning postal route is fortunate, and an integrated communication system with relay points and recognized protocols is resilient. The Romans were not just making things. They were making systems that could survive the ordinary indignities of reality. Wear, delay, shortage, weather, theft, death, distance, incompetence, and time. Time, especially. Because time is what tests whether a society truly understands itself. Any state can appear strong in a season of abundance. The real question is what happens after years of use, under pressure, during partial failure, when pieces begin to give way one by one. Does the whole structure begin to tremble? Or does some other channel carry the weight? Some other road? Some other reservoir? Some other official? Some other shipment? Some other repair crew? Rome lasted as long as it did not because nothing went wrong, but because for a long time enough things could go wrong without breaking everything at once. That is the genius of redundancy. It is rarely celebrated in poetry because it looks inefficient to the impatient mind. Why build another route when one already exists? Why maintain extra capacity? Why insist on standard forms? Why assign inspectors and deputies and overlapping jurisdictions and repeatable materials? Why make the system boring? Because boring systems keep people alive. A world in which every part is unique, improvised, and irreplaceable is a world that shatters beautifully. A world with backups survives its own bad days. The Romans, perhaps more than any ancient civilization at comparable scale, understood that the smooth functioning of ordinary life depends on the ability to absorb disruption without theatrical collapse. That is why so many Roman innovations feel strangely modern even now. Not because we copied every detail, but because we still live inside the logic they sharpened. We still rely on standardization. We still depend on infrastructures whose success lies in not failing publicly. We still need trusted money, clear notices, durable crossings, stored water, controlled interiors, fast communication, organized medicine, and records that outlast the people who wrote them. We still pray, in our own secular way, that the systems under us are being checked before they break. And perhaps that is the most comforting thought to end on tonight. Civilization is not only made by grand vision. It is made by repetition done well, by inspections, by measurements, by extra capacity, by forms that can be understood by strangers, by institutions that remember what individuals forget, by people, often invisible people, who keep the channels clear, the records usable, the messages moving, the lights burning, the bridges sound, the rooms warm, the water flowing. The Roman world eventually cracked, as all human worlds do. Empires thin. Authority corrodes. Trust is diluted. Maintenance slips. The center loses its grip on the edge. Even the best systems cannot defeat time forever. But while they hold, they change the odds of ordinary life. They make hunger less immediate, cold less punishing, injury less fatal, distance less isolating, and uncertainty less likely to become panic. That is no small legacy. So tonight, as the empire settles into darkness, let us leave Rome not with the image of a triumph or a battlefield, but with something quieter. A lamp in a window, water still murmuring through a channel, and a bridge holding under the last cart of the evening, a clerk closing a codex, a courier arriving before midnight, heat lingering beneath the floor, a city continuing because thousands of practical decisions, repeated over years, have made continuation possible. Sometimes humanity is not saved by one invention. Sometimes it is saved by the patient decision to make survival systematic.